I learned the hard way that heating my own property could somehow become someone else's problem when Brenda Patterson showed up at my door on a freezing January morning in Boulder, Colorado, clutching a clipboard like it was a legal warrant. She knocked so hard I thought the door might crack. I was still in my bathrobe, coffee in hand, when I opened it to find her standing there in a puffy white coat that made her look like an aggressive marshmallow. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. "Mr. Grant?" she asked, though she clearly knew who I was. "That's me," I said. "Can I help you?" "I'm Brenda Patterson, president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. I need to discuss an urgent matter regarding your property's heating system." I blinked. "My heating system works fine. House is warm." She pursed her lips. "I'm not talking about your house. I'm talking about the external storage unit attached to your property, the one that shares a wall with the HOA community storage facility." This was news to me. I'd bought this place 6 months ago, a converted industrial building that had been divided into residential units. Mine had an attached storage space that I'd been using for tools and camping gear. I knew the HOA had their own storage on the other side of the wall, but I'd never given it much thought. "What about it?" I asked. "Our storage unit is freezing. We store sensitive community documents, seasonal decorations, and equipment in there. The temperature has dropped to dangerous levels, and we believe it's because you're not adequately heating your storage space." I stared at her. "You want me to heat my storage unit? The building plans indicate that your heating system was designed to maintain temperature in both spaces. By failing to heat your unit, you're causing ours to freeze. That doesn't make any sense. They're separate spaces." She consulted her clipboard. "According to Section 7, Paragraph 12 of the HOA bylaws, all homeowners must maintain their properties in a manner that doesn't negatively impact shared facilities or neighboring units." "Lady, I don't heat storage spaces. Nobody does. It's for storing stuff, not living in." Her eyes narrowed. "This is a violation of your HOA agreement. You have 48 hours to install proper heating in that storage unit and maintain a minimum temperature of 65 degrees, or you'll be fined $500 per day until compliance is achieved." I almost laughed. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious, Mr. Grant. The HOA board voted on this last night. You'll receive official notice via email within the hour." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing there in my bathrobe, wondering if I'd somehow woken up in an alternate dimension where common sense had ceased to exist. True to her word, the email arrived before I'd finished my second cup of coffee. It was loaded with legal jargon and references to bylaws I'd admittedly only skimmed when I bought the place. The key section claimed that because my storage unit and theirs shared a wall, and because the original building design had included a heating system that serviced both spaces, I was obligated to maintain that system. I grabbed my laptop and started digging through the documents from my home purchase. The inspection report, the building plans, everything. After an hour of searching, I found what I was looking for. There had indeed been a shared heating system back when the building was a single commercial space. But when it was converted to residential units, each section got its own independent system. My storage unit had a small baseboard heater that I'd never turned on because, again, it was a storage unit. But then, I found something interesting. The heating line that fed my storage unit had a branch that continued through the wall into the HOA storage space. It wasn't supposed to be there anymore. According to the conversion plans, that line should have been capped when they split the building. But looking at the actual as-built drawings, which I hadn't noticed before, the contractor had left it connected. Essentially, The HOA's storage unit was piggybacking off my heating system. I sat back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. This was insane. They were demanding I heat my storage unit, but what they really wanted was for me to heat their storage unit using my electricity and my equipment. I pulled up my utility bills and started comparing them to what they should have been. Sure enough, my electricity usage was about 15% higher than expected for a space my size. I chalked it up to poor insulation or old appliances, but now I knew better. I'd been heating their storage unit for 6 months without knowing it. My phone rang. It was my buddy Marcus, who worked in property law. "Marcus, I need advice," I said, and explained the whole situation. He let out a low whistle. "That's ballsy. They're essentially stealing your utilities and then threatening to fine you if you stop providing them. Can they do that, legally?" "Hell no. The HOA agreement you signed obligates you to maintain your property to certain standards, but it doesn't require you to provide utilities to HOA-controlled spaces. That would be insane. Plus, if they've been using your heating without compensation, you could potentially sue them for the cost." "What should I do?" "Document everything. Take photos of the setup, pull your utility bills, get copies of all communication. Then respond in writing that you're happy to discuss the matter, but that you believe there's been a misunderstanding about whose responsibility this is. They're threatening $500 a day fines starting in 48 hours. Let them try. If they actually impose those fines, you'll have grounds for a lawsuit. In the meantime, you might want to make it very clear whose heating system is whose." After hanging up with Marcus, I went down to my storage unit to investigate. It was a decent-sized space, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with concrete walls and a single door. The baseboard heater ran along the back wall, and I could feel warmth radiating from it even though I'd never turned it on. I traced the pipes and found the main shut-off valve in the corner, partially hidden behind some shelving. Next to it was the branch line that went through the wall. There was a valve on that too, currently open. I stood there for a long moment, thinking. Then I closed the valve to the branch line, the one feeding the HOA storage unit. I didn't touch my own heater. If they wanted to claim I needed to maintain heat in my storage space, fine. But I wasn't heating theirs anymore. I took extensive photos and videos of everything, documenting the valve positions, the pipe configuration, all of it. Then I went back upstairs and drafted a detailed email to Brenda Patterson and the HOA board. In it, I explained that I'd investigated the heating situation and discovered that their storage unit had been improperly connected to my heating system during the building conversion. I noted that I'd been unknowingly paying to heat their space for months, and that I expected reimbursement for those costs. I stated that I was happy to maintain appropriate heating in my own storage unit, as was reasonable, but that I would not be providing heat to HOA-controlled spaces at my expense. I attached photos and copies of the building plans. I hit send and waited. The response came within 20 minutes, and it wasn't from Brenda. It was from someone named Richard Hoskins, identified as the HOA's legal counsel. "Mr. Grant, your email has been reviewed by the board. Your interpretation of the building plans is incorrect. The heating system in question was grandfathered in during the conversion process and is considered a shared facility. You are obligated to maintain it. Your closure of the heating valve is a willful violation of your HOA agreement and potentially constitutes vandalism of shared property. You are required to restore heat immediately or face legal action in addition to the daily fines." I read it twice, then called Marcus again. "They're doubling down," I said. They've got a lawyer claiming I'm vandalizing shared property by closing a valve in my own storage unit. What's the lawyer's name? Richard Hoskins. Never heard of him, but that doesn't mean much. Listen, don't respond yet. Let me make some calls. In the meantime, do not turn that heat back on. You're within your rights to control utilities in your own space. The next day, I received a formal notice that I was being fined $500 for the first day of non-compliance. It came via certified mail, along with another letter from Richard Hoskins threatening legal action if I didn't restore heat within 24 hours. I was done playing nice. I responded with my own formal letter, CCing my attorney, Marcus, who'd agreed to represent me. In it, we stated clearly that I had not disconnected my storage unit's heat, only closed a valve that fed an improperly connected external space. We noted that the HOA had been essentially stealing utilities from me, and that any fines imposed would be countered with a lawsuit for utility theft, harassment, and improper use of HOA authority. We demanded detailed building inspection records and documentation of when and why the heating line had been left connected during the conversion. We also requested an emergency meeting of the HOA board to address the issue. Brenda called me that evening, her voice shrill. "You can't bring lawyers into this. This is an HOA matter, not a court case. You brought a lawyer into it," I pointed out. "Richard Hoskins sent me 2 letters. That's different. Richard advises the board you're being hostile and uncooperative. Brenda, I'm being reasonable. I'm not required to heat your storage unit with my electricity. If you want heat in your space, install your own system. The building can't support another heating system in that location. The electrical panel isn't rated for it. Then you have a problem, but it's not my problem. We'll see what the judge says when we take you to court. Looking forward to it," I said and hung up. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, 6 days away. In the meantime, I received a second fine notice, bringing my total alleged debt to $1,000. I filed both notices in a folder and continued documenting everything. Marcus did some digging and found out that Richard Hoskins was Brenda Patterson's brother-in-law. He was a real lawyer, but his specialty was estate planning, not property law. He was doing her a favor, probably without fully understanding the situation. "This gets better," Marcus said when he called with the news. "I pulled the building permit records for the conversion, the heating line that feeds their storage unit. It was supposed to be capped and disconnected. The contractor who did the work cut corners. The city inspector never caught it because it wasn't visible during the final inspection. Technically, the HOA's storage unit has been operating with an unpermitted heating connection for 3 years. So, what does that mean? It means they don't have a leg to stand on. That heating line is essentially illegal. Even if they wanted to argue about shared facilities, they can't because the facility itself violates building codes. If this goes to court, they're screwed. Should I report it to the city? Not yet. Let's see how the meeting goes, but keep it in your back pocket." The Thursday meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the main entrance of Pine Ridge. I arrived 10 minutes early with Marcus in tow. The room was set up with a long table at the front for the board members and rows of chairs for residents. About 15 people were already seated, mostly neighbors I recognized but had never really talked to. Brenda sat at the center of the table, flanked by 4 other board members. Richard Hoskins sat off to the side with his own small table covered in papers. The meeting started with routine business. Minutes from the last meeting, treasury reports, a discussion about landscaping contracts. I waited impatiently while they droned on about mulch quality and sprinkler schedules. Finally, after 30 minutes, Brenda cleared her throat and said, We now move to new business. Item 1. The heating dispute with Mr. Yates Grant of Unit 17. I sat up straighter. Marcus put a hand on my arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. Mr. Grant has refused to comply with his obligation to maintain proper heating in his storage unit, Brenda continued. This has resulted in dangerous temperature drops in the adjacent HOA storage facility, potentially damaging community property. Mr. Grant has been fined $1,000 to date and faces additional fines until he complies. Mr. Grant, would you like to address the board? I stood up. Yes, I would. First, I want to clarify that I haven't refused to heat my storage unit. In fact, the heater in my unit is functioning normally and has been since I moved in. What I have done is close a valve that was feeding an improperly connected heating line into the HOA storage unit. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Brenda's face reddened. That's not accurate. The heating system is shared as designed. No, it's not, I said. When this building was converted from commercial to residential use, the heating systems were supposed to be separated. The contractor failed to cap the line that ran into what became the HOA storage unit. For the past 3 years, whoever lived in my unit before me was unknowingly heating your space with their electricity. I only discovered this when you demanded I heat my storage unit. I nodded to Marcus, who stood and addressed the board. I'm Marcus Chen, Mr. Grant's attorney. We've reviewed the building permits and conversion plans extensively. The heating connection in question was never authorized as a permanent installation. It should have been removed during the conversion. Its current existence violates city building codes. Richard Hoskins shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. One of the other board members, a gray-haired man whose nameplate read Tom Reeves, spoke up. Are you saying the HOA has been improperly using Mr. Grant's utilities? That's exactly what I'm saying, Marcus replied. And the utilities of the previous owner before him. We estimate the cost at approximately $40 per month, which over 3 years amounts to roughly $1,400 in stolen electricity and heating. We didn't steal anything, Brenda snapped. The system was in place when we took over the HOA board. Intent doesn't matter, Marcus said calmly. The fact is, you've been benefiting from utilities you didn't pay for, and now you're attempting to fine Mr. Grant for stopping that benefit. That's not just unethical, it's potentially illegal. The room erupted in conversation. Several residents were talking at once, some to each other, some calling out questions. Brenda banged a gavel on the table, trying to restore order. This is ridiculous, she shouted. Richard, tell them. Richard Hoskins stood up, looking deeply uncomfortable. I advised the board based on the information provided to me. If there are building code violations involved, that changes the situation. I would need to review the permit documents. We have copies for you, Marcus said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. Along with copies of Mr. Grant's utility bills showing the excessive usage, and expert testimony from a licensed HVAC contractor confirming that the connection is both unauthorized and improperly configured. Brenda looked like she was about to explode. This is a witch hunt. Mr. Grant is trying to weasel out of his responsibilities. Tom Reeves held up a hand. Brenda, maybe we should table this until we can review all the documentation. If Mr. Grant is right about the building codes, we need to address that before we can enforce any fines. We voted on this. We voted based on incomplete information, Tom said firmly. I move that we suspend all fines against Mr. Grant pending a full review of the heating system and the relevant building permits. Another board member, a woman named Susan Lynch, seconded the motion. Brenda looked furious but called for a vote. It passed 4-1 with only Brenda voting against. I sat back down, feeling a surge of relief. Marcus leaned over and whispered, "Good start, but this isn't over. She's not going to give up easily." He was right. Over the next week, I received multiple emails from Brenda demanding access to my storage unit so the HOA could inspect the heating system. I declined, stating that she was welcome to view it with proper notice and in the presence of my attorney and a neutral building inspector. She never took me up on that offer. Instead, I started getting other types of notices. Suddenly, my trash cans were allegedly in violation of placement guidelines. I was cited for having a garden hose visible from the street. I received a nastily worded letter claiming that my front door needed repainting, even though I just painted it 4 months ago. It was classic HOA retaliation, and I documented every single notice. Marcus advised me to file a complaint with the Colorado HOA Information and Resource Center, a state agency that handled disputes between homeowners and associations. We submitted a detailed packet showing the heating dispute, the improper fines, and the retaliatory citations. We also requested an official investigation into the HOA's practices. While that was pending, I decided to take a closer look at the HOA's finances. As a homeowner in the association, I had a right to review the budget and expenditure reports. I submitted a formal request. Brenda denied it, claiming I hadn't followed proper procedures. I submitted another request, this time with Marcus's help, citing the specific Colorado statute that guaranteed my access. She delayed for 2 weeks, then finally, grudgingly, provided the documents. What I found was interesting. The HOA had been running a deficit for the past 18 months. They'd overspent on landscaping, installing expensive decorative lighting and water features that looked nice, but cost a fortune to maintain. To cover the shortfall, they'd been dipping into the reserve fund, which was supposed to be saved for emergencies and major repairs. But there was one item that really caught my attention. 6 months ago, right around when I moved in, the HOA had paid $3,200 to R. Hoskins Consulting for legal advisory services. Then another $2,800 3 months later, and another $1,500 just last month. They were paying Brenda's brother-in-law thousands of dollars for what should have been routine HOA management, and from what I could tell, he wasn't even doing much. Most of the legal services consisted of him rubber stamping whatever Brenda wanted and writing threatening letters to homeowners who dared to question her. I started talking to other residents. It wasn't hard to find people who were unhappy with how Brenda ran things. There was Dale Morrison, a retired teacher who'd been fined for parking his classic car in his driveway for more than 24 hours. There was Jennifer Wu, a young mother who'd been cited for having a child's playhouse in her backyard that was allegedly not aesthetically consistent with community standards. There was old Mr. Peterson, who'd lived in Pine Ridge for 15 years and had stories about previous HOA boards that had been reasonable and fair before Brenda took over 3 years ago. The more I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Brenda ran the HOA like her personal fiefdom. She used fines and citations as weapons against anyone who disagreed with her. She funneled money to her brother-in-law and to contractors who were probably overcharging because they knew she didn't care. It wasn't her money. I started organizing. I created a private Facebook group for Pine Ridge residents who were interested in HOA reform and transparency. Within a week, I had 30 members. By the end of the month, it was up to 50, nearly half the homes in the community. We shared stories and documents. We discovered that Brenda had approved a $15,000 landscaping enhancement contract with a company owned by her husband's cousin. We found out that she'd been taking a volunteer stipend of $500 a month, which wasn't technically illegal but hadn't been disclosed to the general membership. The state agency got back to me in February, about 6 weeks after I'd filed the complaint. They agreed to conduct a formal investigation into the HOA's practices, particularly regarding the heating dispute and the retaliatory citations. They sent a letter to Brenda informing her of the investigation and requesting that she preserve all relevant documents and communications. She went ballistic. I know this because she showed up at my door again, this time in the evening, and started screaming at me in my doorway. She called me a troublemaker, a liar, and several less printable things. She said I was destroying the community and that everyone would suffer because of me. She said I'd be sorry. I recorded the whole thing on my phone. When she finally left, I immediately sent the video to Marcus and filed a police report for harassment. The police came out, took my statement, and paid Brenda a visit. I don't know exactly what they said to her, but I didn't hear from her directly after that. The HOA board was another matter. Tom Reeves reached out to me privately, via email. He said that he and Susan Lynch were concerned about how things were being handled and that they'd been unaware of some of the financial irregularities I'd uncovered. He asked if I'd be willing to present my findings at the next board meeting. I agreed. The March board meeting had the biggest turnout I'd ever seen. The community center was packed, standing room only. Word had spread through my Facebook group and beyond. People were angry and wanted answers. Brenda tried to maintain control, but it fell apart quickly. Tom Reeves made a motion to add financial review and transparency to the agenda. It passed over Brenda's objections. Then I took the floor. I'd prepared a presentation with charts and documents. I showed the deficit spending. I showed the payments to Richard Hoskins and questioned why we needed to pay thousands for basic services. I showed the landscaping contract and explained the family connection. I showed my own heating situation and explained how the HOA had been improperly using my utilities and then tried to fine me when I stopped. The room was silent when I finished. Then Dale Morrison stood up and started clapping. Jennifer Wu joined in. Within seconds, most of the room was applauding. Brenda's face was purple. "This is outrageous. You have no right to make these accusations." "They're not accusations," Tom Reeves said quietly. "They're documented facts. Brenda, I'm calling for an emergency vote. I move that the board retain an independent auditor to review all HOA finances and contracts from the past 3 years. Susan Lynch seconded. The motion passed 4-1. I move that we suspend all fines and citations pending the completion of the audit and the state investigation, Tom continued. Again, Susan seconded. Again, it passed 4-1. Brenda stood up, shaking with rage. "I resign. You people are ungrateful and foolish, and you deserve whatever happens to this community without proper leadership," she stormed out. Richard Hoskins, looking mortified, gathered his papers and followed her. The meeting dissolved into chaos, everyone talking at once. Tom Reeves banged the gavel and managed to restore some order. "We'll need to elect an interim president and address these issues systematically. I understand everyone is upset, but we need to follow proper procedures. I'm calling for a special election meeting in 2 weeks." The auditor's report came back in late April. It was damning. In addition to the issues I'd identified, they found that Brenda had been approving expenses without proper board votes, had been accepting kickbacks from contractors, and had been misreporting the reserve fund balance to make it look healthier than it was. The total amount of mismanaged or improperly spent HOA funds was estimated at over $40,000. The state investigation concluded around the same time. They found that the HOA had violated multiple Colorado statutes regarding financial transparency, homeowner rights, and proper governance procedures. They imposed fines on the HOA itself and required implementation of new oversight procedures. They also made specific findings regarding my case, stating that the heating situation had been handled improperly and that I was owed reimbursement for utilities, not fines. But the real bombshell came in May. The district attorney's office in Boulder County announced that they were filing criminal charges against Brenda Patterson for theft and embezzlement. Apparently, the auditor's report had revealed that she'd been diverting HOA funds directly into her personal accounts, disguising them as payments to various vendors who either didn't exist or had been drastically overbilled. The charges included 8 counts of theft, 4 counts of forgery, and 2 counts of embezzlement. Total amount, over $60,000 during her 3 years as HOA president. I watched the news report on my laptop, stunned. I'd known she was corrupt, but I hadn't realized the extent of it. Marcus called me right after. "Did you see?" "Just watching now," I said. "This is bigger than we thought. The DA's office is saying she could face up to 10 years if convicted on all counts." "What about Richard Hoskins?" "They're investigating him too, but so far it looks like he was just incompetent, not criminal. He took his sister-in-law's word for things without doing proper due diligence. He'll probably lose his law license or at least get suspended, but criminal charges are unlikely." "And the HOA?" "You're getting a new board. Tom Reeves is interim president until the election. I'd say your problems are over." He was mostly right. The special election happened in June. Tom Reeves was elected president. Susan Lynch became vice president. 3 new board members were elected, including Dale Morrison. One of their first acts was to formally apologize to me and reimburse me for my utility costs, plus an additional $500 as compensation for the harassment and improper fines. They also hired a licensed contractor to properly cap the heating line into the HOA storage unit and install a new, independent heating system in their space. It cost the HOA $8,000, which they paid out of the remaining reserve funds. The valve I'd locked was reopened to feed only my storage unit, which I still didn't bother heating because it was just storage. But I kept the key as a reminder. Brenda's trial happened in October. I was called as a witness, along with several other homeowners and the auditor. The evidence was overwhelming. She'd created fake invoices, forged signatures, and systematically stolen from the HOA over a period of years. Her defense was that she'd been working hard for the community and deserved compensation, but the jury didn't buy it. She was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 6 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 4. She was also ordered to pay full restitution, though everyone knew she'd never be able to come up with $60,000 plus interest. Richard Hoskins was disbarred. He claimed he'd been manipulated by Brenda, which was probably partially true, but the State Bar Association didn't care. He'd failed in his duty to provide competent legal advice and had participated, even if unknowingly, in the fraud. He was done as a lawyer. Pine Ridge, meanwhile, started to heal. The new board was transparent and responsive. They published detailed financial reports every month. They solicited input from residents before making major decisions. They reduced fees where possible and stopped the petty citation campaigns that had made everyone miserable. I even got involved myself, volunteering for the Architectural Review Committee. I figured if I was going to live there, I might as well help make it a better place. My storage unit remained blissfully unheated, except by my own choice. Sometimes on cold days, I'd go down there and turn on the little baseboard heater for a few minutes, just because I could. Just because it was mine, and nobody could tell me I had to heat someone else's space with my own money and electricity. The valve key sat on my keyring, a small brass reminder of the day I decided to push back against unreasonable demands. I never needed to use it again, but I kept it there anyway. Some things are worth holding on to. Life in Pine Ridge wasn't perfect after everything settled down. There were still disputes about landscaping and maintenance and all the usual HOA nonsense. But it was honest nonsense, not corrupt, and that made all the difference. When someone got cited for something, it was because they'd actually violated a reasonable rule, not because they'd pissed off the wrong person. Dale Morrison and I became friends. He'd invite me over for beers on his deck, and we'd talk about cars and retirement plans, and occasionally about the whole saga with Brenda. He'd been dealing with her tyranny longer than I had, and he was still amazed that she'd actually gone to prison. "I knew she was power-hungry," he said one evening, "but I never thought she was actually stealing. I just figured she was a control freak who liked bossing people around." "The power and the money probably went hand in hand," I said. "Once you convince yourself that you're entitled to run everything, it's not a big leap to convince yourself you're entitled to the money too." "Guess so. Still crazy though. All this overheating a storage unit." "That's how it started," I agreed, "but it was never really about the heat. It was about control. She couldn't stand that I'd said no." Jennifer Wu, the woman with the Playhouse citation, also became part of my social circle. Her husband, David, worked in IT and helped me set up a new server for the HOA's document management system. We made everything digital and accessible, with proper security and backups. No more mystery about where the money was going or what the board was doing. Tom Reeves turned out to be exactly the kind of leader the community needed. He was calm, methodical, and fair. He didn't take the job because he wanted power. He took it because someone responsible needed to, and he was willing to do the work. Under his leadership, Pine Ridge actually started to feel like a community instead of a dictatorship. The one lingering issue was the reserve fund. Thanks to Brenda's theft and mismanagement, it was depleted to about 30% of what it should have been. The new board had to implement a special assessment, $200 per household, to begin rebuilding it. Nobody was happy about the extra cost, but everyone understood why it was necessary. We all voted to approve it. I paid my $200 and didn't complain. It was a small price compared to what could have happened if Brenda had continued unchecked for another few years. The community would have been bankrupt, and we all would have been on the hook for much more. In November, about a year after the whole thing started, I was down in my storage unit organizing my camping gear. I was planning a trip to Rocky Mountain National Park and wanted to make sure I had everything. The space was cold but not freezing. The little baseboard heater sat silent against the wall. The valve that had started everything was still there, closed, locked with my key. I heard a knock on the unit door, which was unusual. I opened it to find Tom Reeves standing there with a cardboard box. "Hey, Yates," he said. "Sorry to bother you. Got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" "We're cleaning out the HOA storage unit, getting rid of old junk that's been accumulating for years. Found this and thought you might want it." He handed me the box. Inside were documents, old building plans and inspection reports from when the building had been converted to residential units. Right on top was a work order from the original contractor, with a handwritten note in the margin. "Leave heat line connected to common storage per owner request." I stared at it. This shows someone specifically asked them to leave the line connected. Yeah. I did some digging after we found that. Turns out the developer who converted the building was cutting corners everywhere to save money. He owned the HOA initially, before he sold off all the units. He wanted the HOA storage heated but didn't want to pay to install a separate system, so he just told the contractor to leave it hooked to one of the residential units. That's illegal. Yep. But he didn't care because by the time anyone figured it out, he'd be long gone. Which is exactly what happened. He sold everything and moved to Arizona 5 years ago. The poor person who bought your unit first got stuck heating the HOA storage without knowing it, then you got stuck with it. I shook my head. So this whole thing goes back to some developer trying to save a few $1,000. Isn't it always? Anyway, I thought you'd want this for your records, proof that it was never your responsibility. Thanks, Tom, I appreciate it. He left, and I stood there looking at the documents. One corner cutting decision by a greedy developer years ago had set off a chain of events that led to me getting harassed, Brenda going to prison, and an entire HOA getting turned upside down. It was absurd, but that was life sometimes. Small causes, big effects. I put the documents in the box with my other papers from the case. I'd keep them, maybe forever, just as a reminder of how important it was to stand up for yourself when something didn't seem right. If I'd just gone along with Brenda's demands, I'd still be heating that storage unit, paying for electricity I shouldn't be paying for, and Brenda would still be stealing from everyone and making life miserable for anyone who crossed her. One person saying no had made all the difference. Marcus came over for dinner that weekend. I grilled steaks and made baked potatoes, and we ate on my back deck even though it was chilly. He'd become a good friend through all of this, not just my lawyer. So the DA called me the other day, he said, cutting into his steak. They're trying to track down all of Brenda's assets for the restitution order. Apparently she bought a boat last year with HOA money, claimed it was for community events. It was registered in her husband's name. Did they find it? Yep. Impounded. They're going to auction it off and put the money toward paying back the HOA. Won't cover everything, but it's something. What about the husband? Was he involved? They looked into him but couldn't prove he knew where the money was coming from. He claimed he thought she'd inherited it from a relative. Probably a lie, but there was no evidence to prove otherwise, so they didn't charge him. Lucky guy. Stupid guy. He's divorcing her now, trying to distance himself from the whole thing. Can't say I blame him. We ate in silence for a bit, watching the sun set over the mountains. Colorado was beautiful, especially in late autumn. The aspens had already lost their leaves, but the evergreens were still deep green, and the sky was that particular shade of blue you only got at high altitude. You ever regret buying this place? Marcus asked. I thought about it. No, it's been a headache, sure, but it's also been kind of incredible. I learned a lot about how HOAs work, about standing up for myself, about community organizing. I made some good friends. And I got to see actual justice happen, which doesn't always occur. True. Most HOA disputes just drag on forever and make everyone miserable. This one actually had a resolution. A resolution that involved criminal charges and prison time, I pointed out. That's not exactly typical. No, but Brenda's level of corruption wasn't typical either. Most HOA board members are just busybodies or control freaks. They're annoying, but they're not criminals. She crossed that line big time. What do you think made her do it? I asked. Was it just greed? Marcus considered. Greed was part of it, but I think it was more about power. She liked controlling people, like being important. The money was just a bonus, proof that she was smart enough to get away with it. Except she wasn't. Nobody ever is, eventually. Usually not. The cover-up always gets you. We finished our steaks and moved on to the 6-pack of local IPA I'd picked up. We talked about sports and work and everything except HOAs. It was nice to have a normal conversation about normal things. But later that night, after Marcus left, I found myself back down in the storage unit. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I just wanted to look at the valve one more time to remember. It sat there innocuous, just a small brass fixture on a pipe. If you didn't know the story, you'd never give it a second glance. But I knew, and it meant something to me. I'd locked that valve and kept the key because it was mine to control. Because nobody had the right to demand I provide heat or electricity or anything else to them at my expense. Because standing up for what was right mattered, even when it was difficult, even when it meant conflict. That little valve had become a symbol, not just of my fight with Brenda and the HOA, but of the principle that you don't have to accept unreasonable demands just because someone in authority makes them. You can say no. You can push back. You can demand accountability and transparency and fairness. And sometimes, if you're lucky and persistent, you actually win. I turned off the light and locked the storage unit door behind me. The key to the valve stayed on my keyring next to my car key and house key. I touched it briefly, feeling the worn brass, and smiled. My house was warm. My storage unit was exactly as cold as I wanted it to be. And somewhere in Boulder County, Brenda Patterson was sitting in a prison cell, probably still convinced that she'd been right and everyone else had been wrong. But the truth was simpler than that. She demanded I heat their storage unit. I'd locked the valve and kept the key. And everything that followed was just the consequences of those two simple actions playing out to their logical conclusion. Justice, I'd learned, didn't always come quickly or easily. But sometimes, if you stood your ground and did the right thing, it came anyway. And that was enough. The wind picked up as I walked back to my house, carrying the sharp, clean scent of mountain snow. Winter was coming again, another year, another heating season. But this time, I'd be warm in my home, comfortable in my space, and completely unbothered by the temperature in anyone else's storage unit. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and started making plans for that camping trip. Rocky Mountain National Park in winter was challenging but beautiful, and I was ready for a real adventure, one that didn't involve HOAs or lawsuits or corrupt board presidents. Just me, the mountains, and the freedom that came from knowing I'd stood up for myself when it mattered most. The valve key jingled on my keyring as I walked through my house, a small brass reminder that sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest meanings. And in the end, that was the real story. Not about heating or storage units or even HOA corruption, but about a simple principle. What's yours is yours, and nobody gets to take it without permission. Not heat, not electricity, not money, and definitely not your dignity. I'd kept the key and I'd kept my self-respect. Everything else was just details.